Don't open your door for Christmas trick-or-treaters. I first noticed the strange car 3 days before Christmas. It was so dented, scratched, and splattered with mud that it was impossible to tell what the original color had been. Its rusted metal guts rattled menacingly each time it rolled by. The driver was cruising my neighborhood, looking for something, and there was something predatory about the way he inspected each house on the silent winter street. I felt myself tense up when the car passed by, like my body was readying itself for an attack. Even my dog Marvin huddled close to my leg, whimpering. And sure, maybe the driver was just a porch pirate looking to steal someone's holiday cheer, but you can never really be sure, can you? A shiver ran up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The brown car reminded me of everything I'd worked so hard to leave behind: ugliness, danger, neighborhoods where the stores had barred windows and gunshots rang out at night. I'd worked all my life to afford a house like the one I had now, and the thought that all that could reach me even here was more than a little disconcerting. Lost in thought, I turned up my driveway, but Marvin had stopped and was growling at something. A rumbling engine pulled up beside me. The driver rolled down his window and shouted at me. "Howdy, neighbor. Any plans for the holidays?" I muttered something about staying home before it occurred to me that I should definitely not be sharing my plans with this weird stranger. He was a grizzled middle-aged white guy with unkempt gray hair and wild eyes that suggested it had been a while since he'd last slept. His glare narrowed at my response. "You sure, pal? Not gonna go visit family? Maybe travel someplace far away? You and your dog really ought to go someplace for a while. Maybe come back in the new year after things have settled down. You hear me? You really ought to get out of town." I was about to ask the guy who the hell he thought he was to tell me how to spend my time, but he already sped off in a cloud of black exhaust. Scratching my head, I went inside to feed Marvin and make sure that all the doors were locked. I slept badly that night, and my nightmares were filled with the haunted eyes of the man in the brown car. At one point, I even thought I felt his large, hairy hands pulling for me beneath the blankets, but it was just Marvin readjusting himself at my side. I didn't notice the figure standing at the edge of my yard the next morning, not until they began to speak. I couldn't make out their features in the pre-dawn gloom, just a shapeless hat and bulky, ragged clothes that made them look like an overstuffed scarecrow. "Howdy, neighbor," they called out to me. "Any plans for the holidays?" It was the exact same phrase that the man in the brown car had used, but the voice was different. Deep and guttural, it sounded more like animals trying to imitate human speech than an actual person talking. Inside the house, Marvin was going crazy. I suddenly had an awful feeling that maybe the stranger's stuffy clothes weren't there to keep off the cold, but rather that they were hiding something horrible, maybe even a lot of somethings, all writhing and coiling together. It leaned uncannily toward me, and I realized for the first time just how tall it was. Shaking my head, I climbed into my half-defrosted car and backed out of the driveway. The thing's proportions were all wrong, its arms and torso too long, its legs too short and seemingly bent backwards. It stayed still, watching my taillights disappear around the corner. When I returned from home hours later, I was relieved to find that the house was still intact and Marvin was safe and sound. That night, as I fed the dog and made dinner for myself, it was easy to believe that I'd scared myself over nothing. At least, until the doorbell rang. Some instinct made me bring the kitchen knife with me when I went to answer it, and when I saw who was waiting on the other side, I was glad that I did. It was the man from the brown car. "What do you want?" I opened the door just a crack, leaving the chain on, even though the big man could have kicked it in if he'd wanted to. "Put that damn knife away and listen to me," the man snarled. "It won't do you any good against them, anyway. You need to get out of town until it's over." "Until what's over?" I groaned. Marvin peeked out from behind me, crept toward the stranger, and sniffed his boot. To my surprise, he actually seemed to like the guy. "Look, you don't have to believe me, but at least believe the symbol on your door." I moved my hand to undo the chain so that I could check the door, then I hesitated. What if it was a trick? the stranger stuck his hand inside the house. I tensed up, ready for anything, but he just scratched Marvin behind the ears. I undid the chain. Sure enough, barely visible marks had been scratched all around my Christmas wreath. They were twisting and serpentine, seeming to coil and rearrange themselves each time I looked away. You could have put those there yourself, I told the man, not wanting to believe what I was seeing. Sure, I could have. But I didn't, and you know it. Trust me, go somewhere for a while. Leave tonight, before sunset. When you get back, your house might be a little torn up, but at least you and your dog will be alive. Don't ask me why, you're better off not knowing. You have no idea what I went through to get this place, I snapped, and I'm not going to run off and leave it just because you say so. I mean, I don't even know your name. It's Eddie. The big man stuck out his hand. And I'm not gonna stand out here freezing on your porch forever. You really want to hear about it? Invite me inside. I thought about vampires, fae, and other storybook monsters that needed permission to enter a home. Then I shrugged and opened the door. I don't know who or what they are. A cult maybe, or something else, something not even human. Eddie spoke into the cup of coffee I'd given him. We were seated at my kitchen table, Marvin at our feet. All I know is, there are things out there that hate the holiday season. Things that prefer how it was before, when people believed that only a human sacrifice could keep the shortening days from fading into one last, eternal night. They come creeping out of the darkness this time of year, thirsty for the blood that we no longer offer them so willingly. 5 years ago, I was sitting where you are now. I hadn't heard the stories, and I wouldn't have believed them if I had. I was a construction contractor with a house in the suburbs, a wife, and 2 beautiful children. I'd never seen or experienced anything that could cause me to doubt the laws of science. Then, on Christmas Eve, I heard a knock on the door. I turned on the porch light and saw 3 of them looking in the window. They looked young, like kids or teenagers, and they were wearing Halloween costumes. My first thought wasn't fear, not even when I saw that dead, hollow look in their eyes. It was concern. I mean, it was below zero out there, and one of them, a pale blonde boy in a skeleton costume, wasn't even wearing shoes. The girl behind him was wearing a flimsy fairy costume with ripped up wings, and the snow was falling right onto her bare skin. They were gonna freeze to death out there, whoever they were, so I opened the door, and that's when they took out their weapons. The boy in the skeleton costume pulled a length of chain with a meat hook on the end from his skull-shaped plastic bucket. The girl had been hiding a pair of butcher knives in her fairy wings. Another, whose shape was hidden by a bulky scarecrow costume, was holding a razor-sharp reaper's scythe. When I tried to slam the door on them, the scarecrow swung it into the gap, and the trio forced their way inside. I would have thought I was dreaming, but the clang of metal digging into the wall was all too real. They started hacking down my decorations with a cold, passionless hatred that I'd never seen before or since. I ran. What else could I do? I didn't have a weapon, and I had to warn my family. My kids were watching some movie in the family room, but my wife heard the destruction and came to investigate. She barely had time to register the look for terror on my face before the girl in the fairy costume was on her, running across the wall like a goddamn spider and sinking her teeth into my wife's neck. Until the day I die, I'll never forget those teeth. They were filed down and sharp, the gums curled back like the girl was surviving on something that humans weren't meant to eat, if she was even human in the first place. I looked around for a weapon, but the only thing at hand was a wine bottle from dinner. I shattered it on the head of the one attacking my wife, but the fairy costume girl didn't seem to notice. She just stared at me with those blank, dead eyes. Then I felt something wet running down my ribs. The scythe was so sharp that I had barely even felt its cut at first, but then it turned to agony. By that point, the kids were up and moving around, and all I could think of was them. I had to protect them. Pressing my hand against the bleeding gash in my side, I hobbled to the living room. The scarecrow followed after me like he had all the time in the world. The lights were out in the living room. A Christmas Carol was still playing soundlessly on the screen, but to my horror the kids were nowhere to be seen. Behind me, I could hear the sound of Skeleton Boy shredding more of our decorations, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before the intruders tore me apart just as mindlessly. I glanced down at eyes glittering beneath the couch. It was the kids. Their eyes got wide when they saw the crimson stain on the side of my white t-shirt, but I pressed a finger to my lips and gestured that they should follow me. We kept low, crawling across the carpet and hoping that the hellish figures destroying our house wouldn't stop to peek over the edge of the couch. We were almost to the basement stairs when I smelled something burning. Thick, black smoke billowed up from the corner of the room where our Christmas tree was on fire. Backlit against the flames stood the Skeleton Boy, whirling his chain and looking right at us. I yelled at the kids to run and threw myself at him. He wasn't even half my size, but it was like hitting a marble statue. He didn't even seem to notice the blows of my fists. Instead, he whipped me with the chain until I screamed in pain, blinded by my own blood and helpless to fight back. The metal links of the chain coiled around my neck, and I remember thinking, at least the kids got away. Then he tugged hard, ripping the skin of my neck, but cutting me loose. I tumbled down into the basement, and even though the house was burning down around us, he walked down the stairs slowly. He kept me alive on purpose, but why? It was like the three of them were drawing energy from our pain and fear. I locked one of the basement doors behind me, not like I thought it would do much good, and pulled my kids into a closet with me. I hugged them close, holding a spit-dampened cloth over my mouth against the tendrils of smoke that were creeping under the door. I heard the lock snap. The outer door flew open. The kids and I were soaked in sweat. I could hear the walls snap and crackle as flames consumed the house, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the calm footsteps of the boy in the skeleton costume as he strolled toward our hiding place, dragging his chain along the floor behind him. Everything around me was becoming hazy and gray. My lungs felt like they were being squeezed, crushed slowly by some enormous hand. Then came a sudden, loud crack, and everything went black. According to the rescue workers, I had passed out from smoke inhalation moments after the central supports of the house collapsed. My kiddos, they said they were ended instantly. A ruptured water line prevented the fire from roasting me alive, like my wife had been. I'd survived, but I was in rough shape. There were months of hospital care, rehabilitation, and psychiatric evaluation. The bills left me penniless. Worst of all, those damn head doctors made me question what I knew had happened that night. They blamed my memories on smoke inhalation and brain damage, and there was no evidence left to prove them wrong. I later learned that even if there had been, it wouldn't have mattered. By the time I got out of that place, I didn't know what was real anymore. But little by little, I began doing research about holiday home invasions, and I realized that I wasn't alone. There were hundreds of cases, all written up as isolated incidents, even though many of them shared the same characteristics. There were hardly ever any survivors, but if there were, they always described the same thing: people in costume who invaded their homes to perpetrate acts of horrible violence. They always set fire to the structures afterwards, like the people inside were some sort of burnt sacrifice. When I took what I found to the police, I was ignored, although whether that was because of incompetence or some kind of cover-up, I couldn't say. After all, think about what would happen if the public knew that people were attacked at random every holiday season and that the authorities were powerless to stop it. There would be mass panic. So in the end, I did the only thing I could do. I decided to fight back myself. At first, I thought that the attacks were random, but they're not. Eddie took out a map. A black spot marked the location of each attack. He had connected them with lines of red marker that crept across the paper like blood. They seemed to form a half-finished symbol, a star with too many points. That's how I knew that the next attack was going to happen in this neighborhood. And when I saw the symbol on your door, Eddie had run out of words. His voice was hoarse, almost desperate. I had the feeling that it had been a long time since he'd spoken like this to another human being. Maybe that was why we'd both gotten lost in his story and forgotten about the time. 3 knocks came at the door, so hard and heavy that the whole house seemed to shake. My eyes darted to the window. It was dark outside. The blood rushed from Eddie's face. Oh God, I was too late. They're already here. He pressed a finger to his lips and directed me to follow him down the hallway. In the shadows of the porch, I could barely make out a skull-painted face pressed against the glass. I grabbed Marvin and nodded toward the back. We could slip out across the yard, and the back door flew off of its hinges before I could finish my thought. A bulky figure in a scarecrow costume stepped through it, cutting down the row of stockings I'd hung on the wall with a single sweep of its scythe. Marvin lunged toward it, barking his head off. His collar slipped through my fingers, and the hulking, tattered figure turned toward him. Bang! The deafening blast repeated 4 times more as Eddie crossed the kitchen toward the scarecrow man, a .45 caliber revolver in his shaking hand. Not again, he snarled. Not this time. Eddie's shots hadn't had the impact that they should have. The scarecrow was still standing. Either there was some kind of body armor beneath those filthy rags, or whatever was under there wasn't human. It flung its scythe at Eddie. I looked away just in time, but couldn't block out the awful sound of a sharpened blade cutting into meat. As the scarecrow crossed the kitchen to finish the job, I heard something else, the front door creaking open and the steady whirling of a chain. Skeleton Boy had broken in somehow, which left only one. Where was the girl with fairy wings? At first, I thought the noise was coming from inside the walls. Then I saw a pale soot-covered hand emerging from the hearth. Like some diabolical version of Santa Claus, she'd come down the chimney. Eddie hadn't been able to stop the invaders, but the distraction had given me time to grab Marvin's collar and drag him upstairs with me. I was panicking, but I had a plan: crawl out onto the roof, jump down into the yard, and run across the snow as fast as my legs could take me. I could smell smoke from down below, and hear footsteps on the stairs behind me. They moved slowly, just like Eddie had said, savoring our fear and helplessness. But Marvin and I weren't going to wait around to be strangled by a chain, hacked apart by a scythe, or eaten alive. I dragged my howling dog into the bedroom and blocked the doorknob with a chair. I flung open a window, letting in a flurry of snow. Marvin whimpered when I set him down on the slick shingles. I stroked his fur and tried to keep him calm as I climbed outside myself. The roof was treacherous, but we didn't have much time. The reflection of flames flickered on the snow below us, and fire alarms were going off throughout the house. We skidded on the cramped, icy roof as we crept around to the back, and jumped. My ankle folded under me and pain shot up my leg, but Marvin was safe in my arms. When I set him down, he was wagging his tail, cocking his head to the side and looking curiously at the burning house behind me. He followed me as I limped toward the home of the nearest neighbor, hoping that they, too, hadn't received a visit from the nightmarish trick-or-treaters. But when I turned to look over my shoulder, I saw 3 dark figures staring out the window of my flaming kitchen, watching me run, like they had all the time in the world. Mrs. Fisher across the street didn't understand my incoherent story, but she could see the fire out of her window clearly enough. She called 911, made me a hot cup of tea, and even brought Marvin some ancient dog biscuits she found somewhere. But when emergency services arrived, there was no sign of the invaders I described. Just like before, with Eddie's family, the fire had destroyed all evidence of their presence. Between the clear case of arson and Eddie's charred body, it was clear that something had happened, but no one was willing to believe my version of events. It's been a year since that night, and the case remains open. Now, as the days get colder and the nights grow longer, I think more and more about Eddie. About how he thought that he had escaped them, how he thought he was the hunter instead of the hunted, and it makes me wonder, will I be getting another visit this year?